Welcome to Katha, a dusty little town in Upper Burma, where the sun beats down like it's got a personal vendetta, and the British Empire clings to its last shreds of glory like a drunk to his last pint. It's the 1920s, and the Empire is still pretending it's the center of the world, even as the cracks start to show. This is the story of Edward Harrington, a district officer who's been stuck in this god-forsaken place for longer than he cares to remember. He's not your typical Pukka Sahib, though. While his fellow expats are busy sipping gin and lamenting the heat, Edward has a habit of questioning things. Things like why they're here, what they're doing, and whether it's all worth it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, let's set the scene. Katha is a place where the British live in their little bubble, with their bungalows, their servants, and their precious European club, where the only thing more exclusive than the membership is the snobbery. It's a world where the natives are seen but not heard, unless they're serving drinks or being patronized. The air is thick with the scent of teak, sweat, and self-importance, and the only thing that moves faster than the gossip is the monsoon. Edward, however, is different. He's got a soft spot for the Burmese, much to the chagrin of his peers. He speaks the language, reads their literature, and even has a few friends among the locals. It's not that he's a saint. Far from it. He's got his own demons, his own regrets. But as we'll see, Edward's life is about to get a lot more complicated. There's a rebellion brewing, a personal crisis looming, and a choice to be made between loyalty to the Empire and loyalty to his own conscience. So, grab a drink, settle in, and let's dive into the world of Edward Harrington, where the lines between right and wrong are as blurry as the horizon on a hot Burmese day. Picture Edward Harrington, a lanky chap in his mid-30s, stepping off a steamship onto the docks of Rangoon after a 3-week slog across the Indian Ocean. The year's 1925, and the air's so thick with humidity it's practically a second skin. Teak, spices, and a whiff of fish hit him like a poorly aimed cricket ball, and he fumbles with his pith helmet, already regretting the wool suit sticking to his back. Rangoon's a riot of noise and colour. Dock workers shouting, coolies hauling crates, merchants haggling in a dozen tongues. Grand colonial buildings, all pomp and symmetry, loom over bustling bazaars and pagodas that shimmer like they've been dipped in gold. It's the British Empire in full swagger, and Edward can't help but feel a twinge of pride. Railways, telegraphs, schools, this, he's been told, is progress, the gift of civilization wrapped in a Union Jack. Yet, as he weaves through the crowd, something nags at him. The British saunter about in crisp linens, trailed by Burmese servants, while local families huddle in thatched homes, their lives a world apart. It's a hierarchy as clear as the Shwedagon pagoda's spire against the sky, and Edward wonders if progress looks the same to everyone. Still, he's young, eager, and brimming with the sort of optimism that only a fresh posting can spark. He's here to do his bit for king and country, to bring order to this corner of the empire, and maybe, just maybe, leave things better than he found them. After clearing customs with a nod and a signature, Edward hires a rickshaw to the European Club, the unofficial headquarters for every Brit in Rangoon who fancies a gin and a grumble. The ride's a kaleidoscope of the city, tree-lined boulevards, colonial mansions with verandas, and markets where vendors hawk mangoes and betel nuts. At the club, a mustachioed secretary greets him with a handshake and a smirk. "Welcome to Rangoon, Harrington. Journey bearable, I hope." "Barely," Edward quips, wiping sweat from his brow. "Feels like I've been boiled in my own suit." "You'll get used to it," the secretary chuckles, "or you won't. Either way, we stick together here. Makes the whole thing tolerable." Edward settles into a room overlooking the city, the Shwedagon pagoda glowing gold in the sunset. It's a sight that stirs something in him. Wonder, maybe, or the thrill of a new beginning. He's ready to dive into this strange, vibrant world and prove he's more than just another sahib. A few days later, his posting comes through Katha, a speck of a town in Upper Burma. The journey means trading Rangoon's chaos for the slow churn of a river steamer up the Irrawaddy courtesy of the Irrawaddy Flotilla Company, which runs Burma's rivers like a well-oiled clock. The steamers are floating microcosm, British officials in starched collars, merchants counting their profits, Burmese passengers chatting in soft, melodic tones. Edward leans against the rail, watching the riverbanks slide by. Lush green jungles, villages with thatched roofs, pagodas peeking through the trees. It's breathtaking, like a painting come to life, and he feels a pang of awe at this land he's meant to help govern. The river's alive with activity, women washing clothes, children splashing, fishermen casting nets. It's a world of simplicity, untouched by the hustle of Rangoon, and Edward finds himself charmed. He tries a few Burmese phrases with a fellow passenger, earning a smile, but feeling the gap between them, a divide he can't quite name. At night, the steamer docks at sleepy towns, and Edward wanders the markets, marvelling at the lanterns and the chatter. He's an outsider here, a curiosity in his khaki and helmet, but the warmth of the locals makes him want to understand them, to bridge that invisible line. As the steamer chugs on, Edward's mind wanders to the Empire's role. The steamer itself, the telegraph poles along the banks, the hospitals in Rangoon, they're proof of British ingenuity, aren't they? Order, infrastructure, education, these are the gifts of civilization, or so he's been taught. But then, he sees a child begging at a dock, a woman bent under a load of firewood, men toiling in fields for wages that barely feed them. Is this progress, or just a prettier cage? He shakes off the thought, chalking it up to travel fatigue. He's here to do his duty, to make a difference, not to question the whole blasted system. Finally, the steamer reaches Katha, a quiet town where the Irrawaddy bends like a lazy snake. Edward steps onto the dock, luggage in hand, and heads to the district office. The town's a mix of British bungalows and Burmese life, markets, temples, homes with woven walls. His quarters are a modest bungalow with a veranda overlooking the river, and as he unpacks, he feels a mix of excitement and nerves. This is his new world, a place to prove himself. The sun sets, painting the river gold, and Edward takes it as a good omen. He's ready to dive in, to navigate this strange, beautiful land and his place in it. Little does he know, Katha will test him in ways he never imagined, blurring the lines between duty, loyalty, and something deeper. Edward Harrington's life in Katha had settled into a peculiar rhythm, like a gramophone record that skips but somehow keeps playing. The days began with the gentle chime of temple bells, a sound that drifted over the Irrawaddy, blending with the morning's first heat. He'd rise at dawn, the air already heavy, and step onto his bungalow's veranda, where Mahla May, his Burmese housekeeper, had laid out breakfast. Strong tea, toast slathered with imported marmalade, and a ripe mango, its juice a fleeting escape from the day's monotony. The veranda, with its view of the river glinting like polished jade, was Edward's sanctuary, a place to sip tea and pretend for a moment that he was more than a cog in the Empire's creaking machine. By 8, he was at the district office, a sturdy teak and brick building that smelled of ink and dust. Here, the real work began, paperwork that could bury a man if he wasn't careful. Reports from the local police, tax ledgers, and petitions from villagers piled up like monsoon clouds. Edward would pore over them, signing permits, reviewing complaints, and untangling disputes over land or water rights. It was tedious, but he took pride in keeping the district's gears turning. The British had brought order after all, roads, railways, a proper legal system. He'd seen the new school in a nearby village, its chalkboards a symbol of progress, and it gave him a quiet satisfaction, even if the locals didn't always share his enthusiasm. Mid-morning often meant court sessions, held in a small room where a creaky fan battled the heat. Edward presided over minor cases, a stolen goat, a market brawl, a dispute over a rice field's boundary. He aimed for fairness, drawing on the British legal code, but he couldn't miss the wary glances from the Burmese plaintiffs. To them, he was an outsider whose rulings however just, carried the weight of foreign authority. It nagged at him, this divide, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. The empire's justice was better than the chaos of the old days, wasn't it? Or so he told himself, though the question lingered like a half-forgotten tune. Lunch was a quiet affair, back at the bungalow. He'd sit in the shade, a book in hand, Kipling's Tales of Empire lately, though their romantic glow felt distant from Katha's realities. Over rice and curry, he'd muse on his role. The British had built bridges, literally and figuratively, connecting villages to markets, bringing schools and hospitals. Yet, he couldn't ignore the barefoot children outside his gate, or the farmers struggling under taxes. Progress, it seemed, came with a price, and Edward wondered who was paying it. Afternoons meant venturing out, often on horseback, to inspect villages or projects. He'd ride to a nearby hamlet to check on a new irrigation ditch or settle a feud between farmers. The villagers were polite, offering tea or betel nuts, but their smiles were guarded. Edward tried to bridge the gap, practicing Burmese phrases he'd learned from Ubatin, a local teacher who'd become an unlikely friend. Ubatin would share stories of Burmese myths, his eyes lighting up as he spoke of ancient kings and forest spirits. Edward soaked it up, fascinated by this world so different from his own, though he sensed a quiet resentment in the man's tales of lost independence. Evenings were for the European Club, Katha's slice of England under the palms. The club was a world of wicker chairs, gin-slings, and the drone of expat chatter, planters grumbling about teak prices, officers swapping tales of London fog. Edward played his part, joining in bridge games or nodding at Colonel Saunders' endless rants about keeping things in order. But the club's exclusivity grated on him. The Burmese were barred, save as servants, and the snobbery hung thicker than the cigar smoke. He'd slip out early sometimes, preferring the quiet of his veranda, where he could hear the river and the distant chants of monks. His growing interest in Burmese culture set him apart. While his peers scoffed at going native, Edward spent evenings with Uba Tin, learning the language and reading Buddhist texts. The teacher's home, a simple wooden house filled with books and incense, was a stark contrast to the club's polished veneer. These visits were a highlight, a chance to see Katha through local eyes, though they also stirred unease. Ubatin spoke of rising nationalist sentiments, of monks and students whispering about self-rule. Edward brushed it off as distant noise, but it planted a seed of doubt. Could the empire's order hold forever? For now, Edward's days were full. Paperwork, court, village visits, club nights. He saw the good in his work, the schools, the roads, the stability. But he also saw the gaps between British ideals and Burmese realities, between his role and his conscience. Katha was home for better or worse, and Edward was determined to navigate its complexities, one day at a time, with a wry smile and a cup of tea. Edward Harrington's days in Katha had taken on a peculiar hue, like a photograph left too long in the sun, familiar, yet fading at the edges. The routine that once felt purposeful now carried a quiet weight, as if each tax ledger he signed or dispute he settled chipped away at his certainty. It was 1925, and the British Empire still strutted about like it owned the world, but Edward was starting to see the cracks in its polished facade. Not that he'd admit it at the European Club, mind you. Doubting the empire there was like questioning the quality of the gin. His morning still began on the veranda, tea in hand, the Irrawaddy shimmering like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. But the district office, once a bastion of order, now felt like a stage for uncomfortable truths. A recent case stuck with him. A Burmese farmer, Yu Kyor, had lost his land to an Indian moneylender backed by British law. Edward had no choice but to uphold the contract, but Yu Kyor's quiet despair lingered. The law was meant to bring fairness, wasn't it? Yet here it was, stripping a man of his livelihood while Edward signed the papers. He couldn't shake the thought that British justice sometimes looked more like British convenience. Afternoon village visits, once a chance to stretch his legs, now brought more unease. Riding through rice fields, he'd see farmers bent under the sun, their yields taxed to fund roads they rarely used. He'd stop to chat, offering clumsy Burmese greetings, and they'd nod politely, but their eyes held a distance. Last week, a village headman had hinted at unrest, grumbles about taxes, whispers of monks preaching change. Edward reported it to his superiors as duty demanded, but he felt a pang of guilt, like he'd betrayed a confidence. The Empire's order was a marvel, schools, bridges, telegraphs. But who was it really for? The question gnawed at him, quiet but persistent. Evenings with Uba Tin, the Burmese teacher, were both a refuge and a reckoning. Over cups of sweet tea in Uba Tin's modest home, Edward learned more than just language. Uba Tin shared tales of Burma's past, kings who built empires, poets who sang of freedom. He spoke of the Shwedagon Pagoda's ancient glory, a symbol of a culture that thrived long before the British arrived. Edward listened, captivated, but also unsettled. Uba Tin's pride in his heritage was infectious, yet it came with stories of loss. Villages uprooted for teak plantations, temples neglected under foreign rule. "We adapt," Uba Tin said once, his smile wry, "but we remember." Edward nodded, but the words hit like a stone. He'd always seen the British as builders, but what if they were also erasers? Back at the European Club, the contrast was stark. The expats toasted the Empire's glory, oblivious to the world beyond their wicker chairs. Colonel Saunders, red-faced from gin, would rant about keeping the natives in line, while others nodded like it was gospel. Edward used to join in, chuckling at the old man's bluster, but now it grated. He'd slip out early, claiming paperwork, and head to his veranda, where the river's murmur felt more honest than the club's chatter. The club's exclusivity, once a comfort, now felt like a cage, separating him from the Burma he was starting to understand. His work didn't help. A new tax policy from Rangoon raised rates on rice farmers, sparking protests in nearby villages. Edward was tasked with enforcing it, riding out to explain the benefits of funding new infrastructure. The villagers listened, stone-faced, as he spoke of roads and schools. One man, bold enough to speak, asked why the schools taught English, not Burmese, and why the roads led to British plantations. Edward had no answer, just a hollow promise to pass it on. Back in his office, he wrote a report, but his pen hesitated. Duty clashed with doubt, and for the first time, he wondered if he was on the right side of progress. Yet, Edward wasn't ready to abandon the Empire's ideals. He still saw the good: hospitals in Rangoon, the steamer that connected Katha to the world, the legal system that, in theory, protected all. He'd visited a new school where children recited English poems, their voices bright with promise. It felt like a step forward, a chance for Burma to join the modern world. But then he'd see those same children's parents, toiling for wages that barely fed them, and the shine would fade. Progress, it seemed, was a coin with two sides, and Edward was starting to see both. By December 1930, Katha felt like a pot left too long on the fire, ready to boil over at the slightest nudge. Edward Harrington, now weathered by 5 years as a district officer, sensed it in the hushed markets, where vendors' chatter was replaced by wary glances. The Irrawaddy still flowed, serene as ever, but the air carried whispers of unrest from the delta, where rice prices had crashed like a poorly played hand of bridge. Taxes, though, stayed sky-high, squeezing farmers until they had nothing left but resentment. Edward knew trouble was brewing, and he wasn't sure he liked being the one tasked with keeping the lid on. Rangoon's telegrams arrived daily, crisp and commanding. Report any agitation. Maintain order. Edward's routine shifted to patrols, riding out with a small escort to villages nestled in the shadow of the Peguyoma Hills. He'd scan for signs of trouble, unusual gatherings, hushed conversations, anything out of place. In one hamlet, he spotted a Galon shrine, a ramshackle altar decked with feathers and strange symbols. The Galon, that mythical bird of Hindu tales, was said to slay serpents, and here it stood as a quiet jab at the British, the serpents in Burma's garden. Edward jotted it down, his pen scratching like a guilty conscience. Back at the district office, he pieced together the rumours. Ubatin, his friend and Burmese teacher, filled in the gaps over tea in his book-lined home. A monk named Saya San, once a physician, had declared himself Thado Minyaung, king of the Galons, rallying peasants with promises of tax relief and a return to Burmese glory. His Galon army was growing, armed with little more than swords and dreams, but fierce with desperation. Ubatin's voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed a spark of pride. "They're tired, Edward," he said. "Tired of losing their land, their rice, their hope." Edward nodded, sipping tea to hide his unease. He'd seen the farmers' calloused hands, the children with hollow cheeks. The economic slump had hit hard, and British taxes, funding roads and schools, yes, but also Rangoon's grand offices, felt like salt in the wound. He reported the shrine and Saya San's name to his superiors, as duty demanded, but each word felt like a betrayal. Rangoon's response was swift. More troops, more arrests, machine guns against bamboo spears. It seemed excessive, like swatting a fly with a sledgehammer. Evenings at the European Club were no escape. Colonel Saunders, his face as red as his gin-soaked nose, thumped the table, bellowing about teaching the natives a lesson. The others nodded, their voices a chorus of indignation, as if the Burmese were naughty schoolboys rather than men pushed to the edge. Edward forced a smile, but his heart wasn't in it. He'd slip out early, claiming paperwork, and retreat to his veranda, where the river's murmur drowned out the club's bluster. The stars above Katha were bright, but Edward felt like he was staring into a void. Ubatin's words echoed one night, as Edward sat with a whiskey, the glass sweating in the heat. "Change is coming," the teacher had said, his smile bittersweet. "Burma will find its way." Edward wanted to believe it, but he'd read the reports. Villages raided, rebels hanged, Saya San captured in a hilltop hideout. The rebellion was crumbling, but at what cost? Thousands dead, families torn apart, and for what? A fleeting dream of freedom? Or was it a cry for something deeper, a life where the Burmese could stand tall? Edward still saw the good in British rule, the schools teaching English, the steamers linking towns, the hospitals saving lives. These were progress, tangible and real. But progress for whom? The farmers he met on patrol didn't care about Rangoon's new railway if they couldn't feed their children. The schools taught foreign poems, not Burmese tales. The hospitals were too far for most. A final telegram from Rangoon confirmed Saya San's execution, hanged for treason, in November 1931. The rebellion was over, officially, but Edward knew better. The anger, the hope, the Galon spirit, they'd linger, like the scent of rain after a storm. He folded the telegram, his fingers lingering on the paper, and looked out at Katha's market, alive again with cautious chatter. Life would go on, but Edward felt a shift inside him, a crack in the foundation of his duty. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew he couldn't stay the same. By early 1931, Katha was a town holding its breath. The Saya San rebellion had spread like a fever, infecting villages with a mix of hope and desperation. Edward Harrington, once a man of quiet routine, now found himself adrift in a sea of orders, reports and whispers of violence. The Irrawaddy flowed on, indifferent to the chaos, but Edward felt as though he were drowning in it. The Empire's grip was tightening, and with it, the noose around his conscience. It began with a patrol to a village nestled in the shadow of the Pegu Yoma Hills, a place where the jungle crept close to the rice fields, as if waiting to reclaim them. Edward rode at the head of a small column, himself, a handful of Indian sepoys, and a Burmese interpreter who looked as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. The village was eerily quiet, the usual bustle replaced by shuttered windows and empty streets. They found no rebels, no weapons, just fearful eyes peeking from behind bamboo walls. As they left, Edward caught sight of a child clutching a wooden toy, her gaze a mix of curiosity and dread. He forced a smile, but it felt like a lie. Back at the district office, the air was thick with the scent of ink and unease. A telegram from Rangoon lay on his desk, its words stark and unyielding. Arrest suspected rebel sympathizers. Maintain order at all costs. The list included names he recognized: a village headman who'd once offered him tea, a farmer who'd petitioned for lower taxes, even a monk known for his fiery sermons. Edward's pen hovered over the arrest warrants, his hand trembling. These were not faceless enemies. They were men with families, with stories, with lives entwined in the fabric of Katha. He signed the papers, each stroke a betrayal, and handed them to his clerk. The Empire's justice, he thought, was a blunt instrument, and he was its reluctant wielder. That evening, he sought refuge at Tin's home, a sanctuary of books and quiet wisdom. Over cups of tea, the teacher's voice was soft, but heavy with sorrow. "My nephew, Ko Maung, has joined the Galen army," Tin confessed, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "He's young, angry. He says the British have taken everything, our land, our pride. I tried to stop him, but—" He trailed off, the silence filled with unspoken fears. Edward felt a pang of guilt, knowing that Ko Maung's name might soon appear on a list, another sympathizer to be rounded up. He wanted to promise protection, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he murmured, "I'll do what I can." A hollow vow in the face of the Empire's machinery. The European Club was no solace. The air buzzed with tension, the gin flowing faster than usual. Colonel Saunders, his moustache quivering with indignation, slammed his glass on the table. "We need to crush this rabble, Harrington. Show them who's boss." The others nodded, their faces flushed with alcohol and bravado. Edward remained silent, his thoughts elsewhere, on Tin's nephew, on the child in the village, on the arrest warrants bearing his signature. He excused himself early, claiming a headache, and retreated to his veranda. The river's murmur was a balm, but it couldn't drown out the clamour in his mind. As the rebellion dragged on, Edward's doubts grew like weeds in a neglected garden. He still believed in the Empire's gifts, schools, hospitals, the rule of law. But the cost was becoming unbearable. Villages were raided, homes burned, and men hanged for daring to dream of freedom. The British response was swift and brutal, Indian troops sweeping through the countryside like a scythe. Edward's patrols became grim processions, each village a tableau of fear and resentment. He'd see Galen symbols scrawled on walls, defiant even in defeat, and wonder if the Empire's order was worth the price. One night, as he sat on his veranda, a telegram arrived, its message a cold slap. "Lead raid on suspected rebel hideout in Peguyoma. Expect resistance." The village in question was one he knew well, a place where he'd once helped build a school, where children had recited English poems with bright eyes. Now, he was to march in with troops, to tear it apart in search of rebels who might not even be there. He crumpled the telegram, his hands shaking. This was the moment, the line he couldn't cross. But what choice did he have? Duty demanded obedience, but his conscience screamed for something else. He thought of Tin, of the child with the toy, of the farmers and monks he'd come to respect. He thought of the Empire's legacy, progress stained with blood, order built on broken backs. As the sun set over Katha, casting long shadows across the river, Edward made his decision. He would go to the village, but not as an enforcer. He would warn them, give them a chance to flee. It was a small act, a drop in the ocean, but it was something. Perhaps in the end that was all he could do. As the dust settled on Katha, Edward stood at a crossroads. The Saya San rebellion had been quelled, but at what cost? The Empire's victory felt hollow, a temporary reprieve rather than a lasting peace. Edward's own journey mirrored this uncertainty. He had seen the best and worst of colonial rule and emerged changed, his certainties shattered. In the quiet of his bungalow, Edward packed his belongings, each item a reminder of his time in Burma. The books Uba Tin had lent him, now dog-eared and annotated, spoke of a culture rich and resilient. The arrest warrants he had signed, now yellowed with age, whispered of a system flawed and fading. Before boarding the steamer, Edward had submitted his resignation to the Colonial Office, a decision long in the making. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, perhaps a quiet life in England, or maybe a new adventure elsewhere. But he knew he could no longer be part of a system he no longer believed in. Though the rebellion was crushed, its echoes would reverberate through the years, a prelude to the struggles that would eventually lead to Burma's independence. Edward's story was but one thread in a tapestry of change, a reminder that empires, like men, are mortal. As the steamer pulled away from the dock, Edward leaned against the railing, his eyes fixed on the receding shoreline. Katha, with its dusty streets and golden pagodas, grew smaller, a memory already tinged with nostalgia and regret. He thought of Uba Tin, of the villagers he had tried to help, of the rebellion that had shaken his world. Burma will find its way, Uba Tin had said. Edward hoped he was right. For himself, he wasn't sure. But as the river carried him toward an uncertain future, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had played his part, however small, in a story much larger than himself. In the distance, the Shwedagon Pagoda gleamed, a beacon of Burma's enduring spirit. Edward smiled, a bittersweet farewell to a land that had taught him more than he ever expected. Edward stepped off the steamer onto Rangoon's bustling docks in the spring of 1932, the air thick with the tang of salt, teak, and 1,000 spices he couldn't name. The city sprawled before him like a living tapestry, grand colonial edifices with their smug symmetry, rubbing shoulders with golden pagodas that seemed to hum with ancient secrets. Rangoon was everything Katha wasn't: loud, alive, and utterly indifferent to the quiet man who'd once fancied himself a cog in the Empire's machine. He adjusted his battered suitcase, squared his shoulders, and plunged into the chaos, hoping to find a new beginning in a city that never seemed to pause. His new role was as a clerk for Messrs. Steele and Sons, a British teak firm whose offices overlooked the Strand, Rangoon's artery of commerce. The work was a far cry from the weighty duties of a district officer in Katha, endless ledgers, export contracts, and letters to Bombay, typed on a clattering underwood that fought him at every keystroke. The office smelled of polish and ambition, its walls adorned with maps of Burma's forests, each green swath a reminder of the wealth flowing out under British hands. Edward found the monotony oddly soothing, a chance to lose himself in numbers rather than the moral quagmires of Katha. Yet, as he tallied shipments bound for Liverpool, he couldn't help but wonder whose labour filled those crates and at what cost. Rangoon streets were a kaleidoscope of life. Mornings began with a rickshaw ride through tree-lined boulevards, past the Secretariat building's red brick pomp and the Sool Pagoda's quiet grace. Vendors hawked betel nuts and mangoes, their voices weaving a melody with the clatter of trams and the chants of monks. Edward marvelled at the city's diversity: Burmese in their longais, Indians in dhotis, Chinese merchants with abacuses clicking like impatient crickets. It was a world apart from Katha's sleepy rhythm, and he felt both thrilled and adrift. A stranger in a city that belonged to everyone and no one. Evenings often found him at the Pegu Club, Rangoon's bastion of Britishness, where the gin flowed freer than the Ayeyarwady and the conversation was as predictable as the monsoon. The club's verandas overlooked manicured lawns. A slice of Surrey dropped into the tropics, and its members, planters, officers, merchants, carried on as if the empire would last forever. Edward reconnected with Major Ellis, a former colleague from his Katha days, whose moustache seemed to have grown even more imperious. "Good to see you back in civilization, Harrington," Ellis boomed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Katha's no place for a man of your caliber." Edward forced a smile, but Ellis's talk of keeping the natives in line grated, a tired refrain from a man who saw Burma as a ledger of profit and power. The Pegu Club was a mirror of the empire's contradictions. Its polished teak floors and crystal chandeliers spoke of wealth, but the Burmese waiters moved like ghosts, seen but never heard. Edward watched them, their faces, masks of deference, and remembered Ubatin's quiet pride in Katha. He'd sip his gin sling, nod at the right moments, but his thoughts wandered to the slums along Sul Pagoda Road, where families huddled in shacks while Rangoon's railways carried teak to distant shores. The British had built marvels, ports, trams, schools, but who were they for? The question lingered, as persistent as the city's humidity. Rangoon was abuzz with talk of the 1932 elections, a step toward Burma's separation from British India. Newspapers like the Rangoon Gazette trumpeted it as progress, but Edward overheard Burmese clerks at the teak firm muttering about half measures and puppets in long yees. The elections promised limited local representation, a nod to the nationalists who'd grown bolder since the Saya San rebellion. Edward read about men like Dr. Bamor, a lawyer pushing for reform, but kept his distance from such debates. He'd left Katha to escape the empire's weight, not to wrestle with its politics. Still, the city's pulse, its protests, its pamphlets, made it hard to ignore the winds of change. His days settled into a rhythm, mornings at the office, afternoons exploring Rangoon's markets, evenings at the Pegu Club or alone on his rented balcony overlooking the river. The balcony was his new veranda, a place to sip tea and watch the city's lights dance on the water. He'd brought Ubatin's books with him, their pages now soft from rereading, and they anchored him in a Burma he was only beginning to understand. The Shwedagon Pagoda loomed in the distance, its golden spire a reminder of a culture that endured despite the empire's shadow. His working-class roots, once a source of unease among the sahibs, felt less defining here. In Katha, they had marked him as different, a Manchester lad among Oxford men. In Rangoon, they were just another thread in the city's diverse tapestry. Yet, his doubts about the empire persisted, like a tune he couldn't unhear. He saw Rangoon's railways as a triumph of British ingenuity, linking villages to the world, but the slums told another story, of progress that skipped over those who needed it most. He wasn't ready to judge the empire, not yet. For now, he was content to live in its contradictions, a man caught between worlds, searching for a place to belong. It was a Sunday afternoon when he decided to visit Ba Tin, his old friend from Katha, now a schoolteacher in Rangoon. The address Ba Tin had given him was in a modest neighbourhood near the Shwedagon Pagoda, a world away from the European quarter's manicured lawns and whitewashed bungalows. Edward hired a rickshaw, the driver a wiry Burmese man with a betel-stained smile, and they weaved through the city's labyrinthine streets. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and street food, and the golden spire of the Shwedagon loomed in the distance, a beacon of Burmese pride. As they approached Ubatin's home, Edward noticed the houses growing smaller, the streets narrower, the children playing barefoot in the dust. It was a far cry from the teak firm's polished offices or the Pegu Club's gin-soaked exclusivity, but it felt more real, more alive. Ubatin's house was a simple wooden structure, its veranda shaded by a thatched roof and adorned with potted plants. The teacher greeted Edward with a warm smile, his eyes crinkling behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Edward, my friend, you found me at last? Come sit, tea will be here soon." They sat on woven mats, and Ubatin's wife, a graceful woman with a kind face, brought out a tray of tea and sweetmeats. Edward felt a pang of nostalgia, remembering their evenings in Katha, discussing Burmese poetry and history by lamplight. "You've adapted well to Rangoon," Edward remarked, sipping his tea. "It's a far cry from Katha." Ubatin chuckled. "Rangoon is a beast, but it's a beast I've learned to tame. Teaching here is different, more students, more ideas, but the children are the same, eager to learn, eager to dream." Edward nodded, but his mind wandered to the British schools he'd seen, their English-centric curriculum a stark contrast to the vibrant Burmese culture around him. "Do you think the schools are helping?" he asked, his tone casual, but his curiosity genuine. Ubatin paused, his expression thoughtful. "They teach English, which is useful, but they also teach the children to see the world through British eyes. It's a double-edged sword. We need the knowledge, but we must not lose ourselves in the process." The conversation shifted to more personal matters. Ubatin spoke of his move to Rangoon after the Saya San rebellion, seeking better opportunities and a chance to be part of the city's intellectual scene. "Katha was home," he said, "but Rangoon is where the future is being written." He then mentioned a group he was part of, a nationalist reading circle that met weekly to discuss Burmese history and independence. "You should come," he urged, as it might help you understand. Edward hesitated. "I'm not sure I'd be welcome." "Nonsense," Ubatin said firmly. "You're my friend and you're curious. That's enough." That evening, Edward found himself in a small tea shop near the Shwedagon Pagoda, its walls adorned with faded posters of Burmese heroes and Buddhist saints. The air was thick with the scent of tea and tobacco, and the low murmur of voices filled the room. Ubatin introduced him to the group, a mix of teachers, monks, and young men with fiery eyes. They nodded politely, but regarded him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, the lone Englishman in their midst. The discussion was in Burmese, but Ubatin translated for Edward, whispering explanations in his ear. They spoke of Burma's history, of the Konbaung dynasty's fall, of the British conquest. One man, a monk with a deep voice, recited a poem about the loss of independence, his words stirring the room. Another, a young teacher, mentioned Dr. Barmore, praising his efforts to push for reform. "He's a voice for Burma," the teacher said. "But the British won't listen." Edward listened, feeling like an intruder in a private conversation. He wanted to ask questions, to understand, but he held back, content to observe. The group's passion was palpable, their hope for a free Burma a living thing, but Edward couldn't help but feel the weight of his own complicity. He was part of the system they railed against, a cog in the Empire's machine. At one point, he reached for a cup of tea only to knock it over, spilling it on the mat. The room fell silent, and Edward felt his face flush. "Apologies," he mumbled, and Ubatin quickly smoothed it over, laughing it off as the Englishman's touch. After the meeting, Ubatin took Edward to a Zat PWE performance, part of the festival celebrations. The festival, marking the end of Buddhist Lent, had transformed Rangoon into a city of lights, with lanterns and candles illuminating every street and pagoda. The air buzzed with excitement. Families and friends gathered to celebrate, their faces aglow with the festival's magic. Edward marvelled at the sight. Pagodas draped in coloured bulbs, food stalls offering mohinga and samosas, children running with sparklers, their laughter echoing through the night. The Zat Pui was held in an open-air theatre, a temporary structure of bamboo and thatch, its stage lit by flickering oil lamps. The audience sat on mats, their chatter hushed as the performance began. The orchestra struck up, its gongs and drums creating a hypnotic rhythm, and the dancers took the stage, their costumes a riot of colour and gold. Edward watched, transfixed, as the story unfolded, a Jataka tale of the Buddha's past lives, told through dance, song, and drama. The lead dancer, a man with the grace of a king, portrayed a prince torn between duty and desire, his movements fluid and precise. The music swelled, the dancers' feet stamping out the rhythm, and Edward felt himself drawn into the story, forgetting for a moment the world outside. Ubatin leaned over explaining the plot. It's the story of Prince Vasantara, who gave away everything, even his children, to achieve enlightenment. It's about sacrifice, about letting go. Edward nodded, captivated by the dancer's energy, the orchestra's relentless beat. The performance lasted well into the night, the audience clapping and cheering, and Edward found himself clapping along, though his rhythm was as off as his earlier tea spill. During a break, Ubatin shared more personal news. "My nephew, Ko Maung, is still in prison," he said, his voice low. "He was arrested after the rebellion, and I fear he'll be there for years. He believed in the cause, but now—" He trailed off, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Edward felt a knot in his stomach. He'd signed the arrest warrants, enforced the crackdowns. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words inadequate. Ubatin waved a hand. "It's not your fault, Edward. You were doing your duty. But duty can be a heavy burden, can't it?" Later, back at Ubatin's home, they talked about education. Ubatin, as a teacher, had seen the British schools up close. "They're well built, with chalkboards and desks," he said, "but they teach English poems, not Burmese tales. The children learn to read, which is good, but they also learn to see the world through British eyes. It's a tool, Edward, a tool for control as much as progress." Edward nodded, thinking of the schools he'd visited in Katha, their neat rows of desks, their British headmasters. "But education can lift people up, can't it?" he asked, his tone uncertain. "It can," Ubatin agreed, "but it must lift them up in their own way, not ours. Look at the Porphy tonight, those stories, those dances. They're our history, our soul. The schools should teach that too." Edward felt the truth in Ubatin's words, but he also remembered the hospitals, the railways, the order the British brought. It was a double-edged sword, progress with a price, and he wasn't sure where he stood. As they sat in the quiet, the festival's lights flickering outside, Edward felt more connected to Burma than ever, but also more conflicted. He was an outsider, a man caught between worlds, and he wondered if he'd ever find his place. The night deepened, and Edward left Ubatin's home, the city's lights guiding him back to his rented room. He thought of the Zat Pui, of Ko Maung's imprisonment, of the schools and their dual role. "Burma's a puzzle," he mused, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. "And I'm just a piece that doesn't quite fit." In the autumn of 1933, Rangoon hummed with its usual restless energy, but Edward Harrington felt a stillness settling over him, like the calm before a monsoon. A letter from England had arrived at his cramped office at Messrs. Steele and Sons, offering a clerk position in Manchester, his hometown. It was a chance to return to familiar streets, to leave behind the heat and contradictions of Burma. Yet as he stood on his balcony, overlooking the river, the city's lights flickering like stars, Edward felt a tug of reluctance. Rangoon, for all its chaos, had become a part of him, just as Katha had before it, His final days in the city were a blur of farewells and reflections. Mornings found him wandering Rangoon's markets, where vendors sold mangoes and jasmine flowers, their voices a lively chorus against the clatter of trams. He passed by the great pagoda, its golden dome glowing under the sun, a symbol of a culture that had endured centuries of change. The streets were alive with people, locals in traditional clothing, Indian merchants, Chinese traders, each face a reminder of Burma's vibrant heart. Edward bought a small carved Buddha from a stall, a keepsake to carry home, though he wondered if it could capture the spirit of the place. Evenings often drew him to the Pegu Club, despite his growing unease with its polished exclusivity. The club was a microcosm of the empire, teak floors gleaming, chandeliers casting a warm glow, and British voices droning on about trade and order. At his final gathering, Major Ellis raised a glass, his moustache twitching with enthusiasm. "To the Empire, Harrington! May it keep Burma on the straight and narrow!" The others cheered, but Edward's smile was thin. He saw the railways and schools they toasted, marvels of British ingenuity, but his mind drifted to the slums he'd passed, where families lived in shacks, while the city's wealth flowed elsewhere. Progress, he thought, was a curious thing, shiny on the surface but uneven in its reach. He sought out Ubatin one last time, finding his friend in the same modest home near the great pagoda. The teacher welcomed him with a familiar smile, offering tea and a plate of sweet rice cakes. They sat on the veranda, the evening air soft with the scent of flowers, and talked of the past and future. Ubatin spoke of his students, their eyes bright with dreams, and of the growing hope for a Burma free to chart its own course. "You've seen our heart, Edward," he said, his voice steady. "Take it with you. Tell your people we are more than a colony." Edward nodded, his throat tight. "I'll try," he said, though he wasn't sure how. He thought of Ubatin's nephew, still in prison, and the villagers he'd met in Katha, their lives shaped by an empire that promised much, but delivered unevenly. "I'm sorry for everything," he added, the words clumsy but sincere. Ubatin waved a hand. "You did what you could. That's enough." Their conversation turned to the changes sweeping Burma. The elections of the previous year had stirred talk of reform, with men like Dr. Barmore pushing for more local control. Ubatin was cautiously hopeful, but Edward kept his thoughts to himself, wary of wading into debates he'd left behind in Katha. Instead, he listened, letting his friend's words paint a picture of a nation on the cusp of something new. As they parted, Ubatin pressed a book into his hands, a collection of Burmese poems, its pages worn but cherished. "For the journey," he said, and Edward felt the weight of the gift, a piece of Burma to carry across the sea. The day of departure came too soon. Edward stood on the docks, his suitcase at his feet, watching coolies load crates onto the steamer bound for England. The river shimmered, reflecting the city's lights, and he thought of his first arrival in Rangoon, full of naive ambition. Katha had changed him, with its quiet struggles and the rebellion that shook his world. Rangoon had deepened that change, showing him a Burma vibrant and resilient, yet strained under colonial rule. He saw the good the British had done, railways linking towns, schools teaching children to read, hospitals saving lives. But he also saw the cost, markets where vendors barely scraped by, pagodas overshadowed by colonial offices, a people whose pride was tested daily. As the steamer's whistle sounded, Edward boarded, finding a spot at the railing. Rangoon began to fade, its golden pagoda a final glint on the horizon. He thought of the empire's promise, to civilize, to uplift, and a sardonic smile crossed his lips. Perhaps it had civilized him instead, teaching him to see the world through eyes not entirely his own. He clutched Ubatin's book, its pages a reminder of a land that had reshaped him. Burma would find its way, he believed, just as he would find his. As the ship cut through the waves, Edward felt a quiet hope, not for the empire, but for the people he'd left behind, and for the man he might yet become.